In late August of 2019, in a stretch of land most people forget exists, a 4-year-old boy named Silas Granger vanished without a sound. The town was called Hartlow, a remote community tucked into the pine-soaked lowlands of eastern Oregon, not far from the Idaho border. Fewer than 600 people lived there, most of them 4th or 5th generation loggers, cattle hands, or retirees who'd grown tired of the city. There was one gas station, 2 churches, and a diner that closed on Tuesdays, just because. Hartlow was the kind of place where front doors didn't lock, and where everyone assumed they'd be safe, because they always had been. Silas Granger lived at the edge of town with his parents, Jacob and Dana Granger, in a modest 1-story cabin surrounded by spruce trees and wire fencing. That fence had one small break in it, where deer used to pass through, and it was this spot, locals would later recall, where Silas was last seen. It was a Thursday. His father said Silas had been playing with an old red plastic fire truck in the dirt near the back steps. The weather was calm, just overcast enough to mute the sky, and the family dog, Blue, a quiet hound mix, lay stretched out nearby. According to Jacob, he stepped inside to get Silas a juice box. "Maybe 30 seconds, he said. A minute at most. But when he came back out, Silas wasn't there. At first, Jacob didn't panic. He assumed the boy had followed Blue to the side yard or gone to toss rocks near the stump. It was only after calling his name 4 or 5 times, with no answer, that he started moving faster. By the time Donna joined in, barefoot and frantic, they were already combing the edges of the woods behind the house, voices rising, hearts racing. By 4:10 p.m., they still hadn't found him. By 4:40, the neighbors had arrived to help. By 5:15, someone was dialing the sheriff's office. And just like that, Hartlow was no longer a quiet place. The call came in to the Wallowa County Sheriff's Office at 5:17 p.m., marked with the quiet urgency that dispatchers know all too well. Not yet panic, but close. A missing child, age 4. Last seen 90 minutes prior, playing near his home off Benton Ridge Road, east of the town center. The dispatcher asked the standard questions: clothing, known hiding spots, pets, recent arguments. Dana's voice cracked when she tried to answer. Jacob took over, speaking clearly but in short bursts, like he'd rehearsed it in his head before dialing. The sheriff's office responded immediately. Within 25 minutes, 2 patrol units arrived at the Granger property. One deputy, Mark Teller, noted that the yard was neatly kept, but surrounded on 3 sides by dense pine cover. He also noted the lack of disturbed ground, the absence of footprints, and something else. The dog, Blue, was lying beneath the porch, silent, unmoving. Didn't bark, didn't chase, didn't whine, Teller later wrote, almost like he'd seen something and shut down. The first official search began before sunset. Deputies, local volunteers, and a fire crew from the neighboring district split into grid teams, combing the wooded terrain behind the property with flashlights, high-visibility vests, and handheld radios. The area was challenging. Uneven ground, thick brush, sudden drop-offs, old logging roads no longer marked on maps. Despite the rapid response, nothing was found that first night. No shoe, no toy, no drag marks, not even a broken branch. By 10:45 p.m., the operation was suspended temporarily due to dropping temperatures and growing fog. A search and rescue unit from LeGrand had been dispatched and would arrive at dawn. That night, Jacob and Dana Granger remained at the edge of the search zone, wrapped in blankets, eyes red, saying little. A few reporters would later mention that Dana hadn't cried publicly, Others noticed Jacob smoked through half a pack of Marlboros but didn't say a word to the volunteers. Some neighbors chalked this up to shock. Others weren't so sure. A search leader, speaking anonymously to the local paper, put it this way: "We've had kids wander off before, not often, but when they do, they leave signs, socks, snack wrappers, a path. With Silas, it was like he evaporated." By dawn on Friday, the full-scale operation was underway. The search radius expanded to 5 miles, extending deep into the timberland that bordered Hartlow's eastern slope. Drones with thermal imaging, K9 units, and aerial support from a state police helicopter swept over gulches, hunting cabins, and creeks swollen from an unseasonable storm just days before. The local church opened its doors to coordinate volunteers. Hot coffee was handed out in paper cups, and people began scribbling their names on sign-in sheets to help look for the boy they'd all known since birth. But while bodies multiplied and maps grew redder, the core mystery held firm. There was no trail to follow. Not a sock, not a print, not even a crushed blade of grass that anyone could confidently tie to Silas. And the dog, Blue, remained an odd footnote. Deputy Teller returned to the Granger's property that morning and tried again to coax a reaction from the hound. But Blue didn't bark, didn't sniff, didn't seem to care about the searchers trudging around his yard. When Teller knelt beside him and gently lifted the dog's muzzle, he saw something unusual: dried blood at the base of Blue's right paw. It wasn't much, just enough to stain the fur, but it didn't look like Silas's. Blue hadn't been limping. There were no visible wounds. The sheriff's office logged the detail but never followed up on it publicly. At 11:22 a.m., the K9 team from LeGrand picked up a short-lived scent trail leading east into the trees. It lasted all of 40 yards before vanishing near an old irrigation trench, half collapsed and filled with stagnant water. The dogs circled, confused. One whined. Another just sat down. That afternoon, a briefing was held with the family and officials. The sheriff, a lean man named Wes Harding, addressed the press for the first time. His words were measured. "We are treating this as an active search and rescue case. There is no indication of foul play at this time." But even then, reporters sensed tension. Dana Granger wouldn't speak. Jacob kept repeating the same sentence. "I just stepped inside for juice." Behind closed doors, Sheriff Harding had begun considering something else. This wasn't a runaway, and it wasn't an accident. By the afternoon of the second day, the search teams were frustrated. The forest around Hartlow was dense, yes, but not impassable. A 4-year-old boy couldn't have covered more than a mile or two on foot. Not barefoot, not in weather like this. And yet, Silas hadn't turned up in any of the logical places. Not the creek beds, not the cabins, not even the culverts where raccoons sometimes nested. The term used was vacuum disappearance, the kind where a child simply ceases to exist within the expected logic of geography and time. But there was one detail no one outside the sheriff's office knew, yet Jacob Granger had not just stepped inside for juice. He'd been inside the house for closer to 10 minutes. This came out during a quiet follow-up interview with deputies late Friday evening, when inconsistencies in his timeline started to show. Initially, Jacob claimed he went in to grab a juice box and check a voicemail. When prompted again, he admitted to taking a phone call from a client in Idaho he did occasional forestry work for. A 7-minute call, confirmed by cell records. He'd walked into the back room to take it. The phone pinged off a nearby tower at 3:48 p.m. By his own words, That meant Silas had been left alone in the yard for over 8 minutes. Enough time to get lost, yes, but also enough time for someone or something to have been watching. When pressed on why he didn't mention the phone call earlier, Jacob just shook his head. Didn't think it mattered. Didn't feel like it counted. Sheriff Harding wasn't so sure. He quietly requested the department review all recent reports of suspicious vehicles in the area. Over the last 2 months, 3 locals had filed informal complaints about a white panel van spotted idling along the southern back roads of Hartlow. No license plate, no driver ever seen, just parked there sometimes for hours, near old timber trails and fire breaks. No one had thought much of it at the time. Meanwhile, on the Granger property, something else strange had emerged. Beneath a window near the back of the house, investigators found a set of faint impressions in the soil. Not footprints exactly, not animal. Just 2 perfect circles like something round and heavy had been set there and removed. There were no other marks, no drag lines, no tread, just the shapes and the silence. As the 3rd day of the search broke over Hartlow, the atmosphere began to change. The volunteers kept showing up, churchgoers, ranchers, teens on summer break, but the energy had shifted. Optimism was thinning. Search teams walked slower now. They weren't calling Silas's name as loudly. What had started as rescue was starting to taste like recovery. And then the rumors started. They began quietly, like as things do in towns like Hartlow. An older woman at the diner said she remembered something. Another child gone missing near the same ridge line in the 1980s. "A cousin of mine," she whispered to a waitress. Only difference was, they found his shoes. That story circulated fast. By noon, someone else mentioned that the Granger land used to be owned by a logging family in the 1940s, the Marrows, who lost 2 boys in a hunting accident, except their bodies were never recovered. The logging camp shut down the next year. Nothing about any of it was official. No records, no missing person reports that could be verified, but suddenly locals were remembering things they hadn't talked about in years. A boy found sleepwalking in the woods. A hunter who swore he heard a child crying only to find an empty clearing. A dog that refused to go past a certain tree line. And as people talked, the Grangers went quiet. Jacob had stopped giving interviews. Dana, pale and withdrawn, began refusing food. Deputies said she hadn't spoken to them at all since Friday night. A therapist from Enterprise was brought in to assess trauma, but Dana wouldn't open the door. She sat on the edge of her bed for hours, rocking slowly, staring at the plastic fire truck that Silas used to drag behind him everywhere. Back at the sheriff's office, Harding had a different concern. A forestry map from 1995 showed an abandoned utility road that ran behind the Granger's property, long since overgrown. It wasn't on modern maps, but it intersected exactly with where the scent trail from the dogs had cut out, 40 yards into the woods near that collapsed irrigation ditch. The question wasn't whether someone had used it. The question was who still remembered it was there. Harding ordered a drone flight down the path at first light. He wouldn't like what they found. At 6:42 a.m. on Sunday, a drone team launched from the Granger's back pasture, following Sheriff Harding's orders to sweep the old utility road that hadn't existed on county maps for nearly 25 years. The area was thick with undergrowth, birch saplings, knee-high ferns, fallen limbs, but through it all, the drone managed to cut a clean visual line. For 300 yards, it was just forest. Quiet, undisturbed, the sort of place where even birdsong sounds hesitant. Then it turned. At 318 yards, nestled in a shallow basin choked with moss, the drone captured something unexpected. A concrete slab, roughly 6 by 8 feet, almost entirely overtaken by vines. No markings, no locks, no handles, just there, like it had been waiting. The footage showed clear signs of recent disruption: scattered pine needles, bent ferns, loose soil at the edges of the slab. One of the deputies watching the live feed leaned closer to the monitor and muttered, "That's not natural." Sheriff Harding didn't respond. He was already sending a ground team. They reached the slab by 8:10 a.m. It wasn't a bunker, not a hatch, just poured concrete. No opening was visible. But the moss wasn't as thick as it should have been, and the ground beneath the northeast corner sounded hollow when tapped. By 8:32, they'd marked it off with flagging tape. But they didn't dig. Harding wasn't ready to explain why. Not to the press, not even to some of his own deputies. Instead, he called in a structural engineer from Pendleton and told the volunteers to stay well clear. Officially, the slab was labeled an abandoned septic site. Privately, he wasn't buying it. That same evening, Harding returned to the Granger property alone. He brought a printed still from the drone footage, slid it onto the kitchen table, and waited. Jacob stared at it for a long time. Finally, he asked, "How long have you known?" Harding didn't answer. He just asked, it a question of his own. "Who built it, Jacob?" There was a silence. Then Jacob said something Harding would later describe as the most unsettling moment of the case. "I didn't even know it was still there. I thought they sealed it in '97. By Monday morning, word about the slab had started to leak. A volunteer with a long-lens camera had captured searchers circling a roped-off square deep in the woods, and within hours, posts began appearing in regional Facebook groups. They found something. Concrete bunker out by the Granger property. Covering up what? Sheriff Harding knew he was out of time. He contacted the county archives and requested any remaining property records tied to the Granger land prior to 2000. What arrived was thin. Just a few scanned documents from 1979, one tax ledger from 1996, and a cryptic code enforcement complaint from April 1997, labeled only, "Unauthorized construction on private timber lease. No follow-up requested. Sealed. Closed." The address listed, Lot 14B, Benton Ridge, the same parcel the Grangers now lived on. The engineer from Pendleton arrived that evening with ground-penetrating radar. The readings were, in his words, inconclusive, but inconsistent with natural subsoil. Beneath the slab, something was there. Not a void, but a cavity, roughly 4 feet deep, with what looked like an artificial border. Sheriff Harding didn't sleep that night. Instead, he met quietly with Earl Dennison, now 83, who had served on the county board back in the 90s. Dennison's hands shook. His eyes stayed on the floor. When asked about the 1997 incident, he didn't deny it. He just whispered, "There was a complaint. A cabin owner reported lights out past the ridge. Said he saw men in reflective vests going into the woods after midnight. No trucks, just walking in. No one logged it officially." Harding pressed further. "What was under the slab?" Dennison hesitated. "We were told to drop it. No one local poured that concrete. That came from out of state. Special mix delivered at night. Guy who did the work didn't even speak. Just nodded a lot and left without saying a word." Back at the Granger home, Dana had finally spoken to a neighbor, quietly, shaking. She said that Silas used to talk to someone just beyond the back fence. Said he called him the Mirror Man. She thought it was just an imaginary friend. That same neighbor told deputies it only got weird when he said the Mirror Man had a door in the ground. On Tuesday morning, under a gray, unmoving sky, Sheriff Harding authorized the excavation. The search perimeter was cleared. Only 4 people were allowed within 20 feet of the slab. the engineer, a structural safety inspector, and 2 deputies with body cams. No reporters, no drones. Harding was taking no chances. At 10:16 a.m., the crew cut the slab at its northeast corner, right where the radar had shown the cavity. The concrete cracked easier than expected, like it had been poured to be temporary. Beneath the slab was not a bunker, not a shelter, not a grave. It was a shaft, just under 4 feet deep, lined with corrugated steel, rusted at the edges but still intact. At the bottom lay a metal panel the size of a hatch door, secured with 2 latches and stamped with a number. 0873A. There were no manufacturer markings, no handles, no airflow vents. The steel showed signs of oxidation but no damage. When they opened it, they found a second compartment, smaller, square, and covered in fine gravel. A sealed plastic sheet was laid across it, and beneath that, nothing. No remains, no equipment. Just a shallow, hollow chamber, 8 feet by 6. But on the underside of the metal hatch, etched into the steel, were 4 words. No one could explain them. ENTR. Denied until recall. Photographs were taken. The chamber was measured, scanned, and sealed again. The slab was never re-poured. Instead, it was fenced off under official notice, designated as a decommissioned service cavity, which meant nothing. Harding didn't bother holding a press conference. But word got out anyway. That night, at a community meeting meant to brief residents on the search's progress, an older man raised his hand. He didn't give his name, but he said something that made the whole room fall quiet. When I was a kid, they told us not to follow lights into the woods, said sometimes the forest turned back on itself, like a loop, like something forgot to finish writing it. People laughed, uneasily, but no one told him he was wrong. It happened on the 5th day. A retired couple, the Whitakers, were checking their seasonal cabin about 3 miles northeast of the Granger property. They'd heard about the search on the radio and figured they might as well check the old place while the authorities combed the area. The cabin had no power, no plumbing, just a wood stove and a rain barrel out back. At 7:42 a.m., Mrs. Whitaker stepped outside to gather kindling and froze. Sitting on the top step of their porch, knees pulled to his chest, face blank and unmoving, was a small boy in a dirt-covered onesie. His lips were cracked, his feet were scraped raw, his eyes, according to her statement, didn't blink right away. It was Silas Granger. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just sat there staring at the tree line across the clearing as if waiting for something to step back out. Mr. Whitaker immediately contacted the sheriff's office. A medevac unit was dispatched. By 8:10 a.m., Silas was wrapped in thermal blankets and en route to Wallowa General. His vitals were shockingly stable. No major dehydration, no hypothermia, just bruises, scratches, and what the attending nurse described as a long stare, like he'd been listening to something that hadn't stopped. Sheriff Harding personally arrived at the cabin less than an hour later. What disturbed him most was the path. There was no path, no broken branches, no footprints, no sign of movement in or out of the clearing. The grass behind the cabin was still beaded with dew, and the only set of prints leading to the steps were barefoot and only appeared halfway across the yard. They just started there, like the boy had been set down. Later that day, when Dana Granger was reunited with her son at the hospital, she tried to embrace him. Silas leaned in, wrapped his arms around her neck, and then whispered something. She froze, pulled back, asked him to repeat it. He said it again. "You came back different." She didn't respond. She just looked at the nurse and asked for the room to be cleared. The doctors couldn't explain it. 5 days in the wilderness, temperatures below 40 at night, limited shelter, no food, no water. And yet, Silas Granger showed no organ damage, no signs of extreme fatigue, and no elevated stress hormones. His blood work came back. Normal. Too normal. But it was his behavior that disturbed the staff the most. He didn't ask about home. He didn't ask for toys or snacks or the dog. He just sat, quietly, patiently, gazing out the window of his hospital room as if watching something approach from a long way off. When asked what happened, he didn't say he was lost. He didn't cry. He didn't talk about fear. What he said calmly was, "I was walking, and it got thin." "What got thin?" the nurse asked. "The place," Silas replied. He didn't elaborate. A child psychologist was brought in from Portland. Her assessment was brief and not especially helpful. She said Silas displayed signs of dissociation, possible trauma-induced detachment. Nothing overtly abnormal for a child who had just survived a traumatic event. But Silas wasn't showing signs of trauma. He was showing signs of removal. There were 3 more incidents that week. The first, Silas woke up standing in the corner of the room facing the wall, hands stiff at his sides. The nurse asked if he was all right. He didn't answer, just turned around and said, "He doesn't like the noise." The second, Dana brought in Silas's favorite book to read to him. Halfway through, he reached up, closed the book gently, and whispered, "He already knows this one." The third, the fire alarm test. A hospital-wide safety drill set off a brief tone. Silas screamed, the only time anyone saw him show panic. He curled up beneath the bed, teeth chattering, eyes wide, not with fear, but recognition. When they calmed him down and asked what scared him, he said, "It sounds like when the door opens." No one knew what that meant. And yet, perhaps they did. At the sheriff's office, Harding received a report, a wildlife cam, set up by a local conservationist near the old utility road, had triggered at 3:19 a.m. the night before Silas was found. There was no animal, just 3 frames. Fog, a shift in light, and then both trees near the concrete slab appeared to be missing their shadows. By the end of the second week, the official search was over. Silas was home, alive, physically unharmed. The case, by definition, was closed. But in Hartlow, no one really believed that. The Grangers locked their doors now. Dana quit her job at the post office. Jacob covered the back window with plywood and canceled plans to build a greenhouse. They didn't speak to reporters. They didn't attend church. They just stayed inside. Silas, for the most part, stayed silent. Except at night. Neighbors reported hearing faint noises from the Granger house, soft knocks on the walls, sometimes 3 in a row, sometimes just 1, no crying, no shouting, just the steady, rhythmic tap, 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 like someone marking time. The sheriff's office had no comment, but Sheriff Harding had already begun making quiet inquiries. He reached out to a retired surveyor named Miller Cranston, who had mapped parts of the Benton Ridge Basin back in 1981, when it was still a timber lease. Harding wanted to know if he remembered anything strange about the area. Changes in compass readings, fog banks that didn't move, sudden radio interference. Cranston laughed. "Oh, that place. We used to call it the Backward Mile." He explained that every team who worked the ridge eventually had a story. Gear that stopped working, strange echo patterns, people hearing their own voice come back wrong. One man had walked into the woods with a GPS unit and returned 2 hours later insisting he'd been gone 10 minutes. Harding asked why none of this was on record. Cranston said the logging company didn't want it on record. Too many complaints would spook buyers. Then he mentioned something else. In 1983, a foreman had filed a quiet report about a sealed shaft they uncovered while clearing brush. Concrete, fresh, looked military. We marked it on the map, then came back a week later and it was gone. Trees replanted, like it had been erased. Harding asked to see that map. Cranston found it, dusty, torn at the edges, but there it was, a red X placed roughly 300 yards behind where the Granger's property now sat. Harding brought it back to his office, laid it beside the modern satellite printout. The marks matched perfectly, and just below Cranston's X was a handwritten note. Do not return alone. On the evening of September 3rd, Sheriff Wes Harding parked his cruiser at the edge of the old utility road 3.5 miles behind the Granger property. He didn't radio it in. He didn't bring backup. He left his phone in the glove compartment. When asked later why he didn't tell anyone, Harding said, "I didn't want anyone following me in or out." He took only a flashlight, a compass, and Cranston's 1983 map. The forest was unusually still. Harding had spent over 20 years walking these woods. He could name trees by bark and birds by wing beat, but that night, everything felt too quiet. No insects, no wind, just the deep, muffled hush of soil that didn't want to be stepped on. The air was warm, but his breath fogged. After 20 minutes of slow walking, his compass needle began to drift, not spin, but waver, like it was resisting something. Harding ignored it. He followed the map, and then he saw it. The clearing, the slab. Now exposed, ringed in yellow tape that had long since drooped and snapped. But something was different. The trees that had once shadowed the slab were gone. Not cut, not fallen, just absent. Their roots remained, their stumps jagged, but the trunks themselves had vanished. 2 smooth holes in the skyline, as though the trees had been lifted out of the earth entirely. Harding moved closer. The hatch had been resealed, the bolts tightened. He crouched to touch the concrete, but stopped. The surface was warm. And then, faint, almost imagined, he heard it, knocking, 3 times, from beneath the slab. Harding stood still for almost a full minute, then reached into his jacket for the crowbar he'd brought. But before he could move, his flashlight flickered. And then, without warning, it went out. Complete darkness. When he turned it back on, 5, maybe 10 seconds later, the slab was cold. No sound, no footprints, just dew settling where his boots had stood. He backed out of the woods without finishing the circuit. Didn't speak on the drive home. Didn't document what he saw. But the next morning, Harding placed 2 officers on 24-hour watch outside the Granger's house. No explanation, no rotation. He just said, "If anything tries to knock, don't open the door." It arrived on a Wednesday. No return address, no postage. Just a plain manila envelope slipped through the Granger's mailbox sometime between midnight and dawn. No one saw who left it. No camera caught the approach. Jacob found it at 6:12 a.m., wedged between a gardening catalog and a credit union statement. The envelope had one word written on it in blue ink, block letters, returned. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. No note, no explanation, just the image. It showed a clearing in the woods, a slab of concrete, 2 trees missing, and a small figure, a child, standing on the edge of the concrete with arms at his sides. It was Silas. Not after his return, but during the 5 days he was gone. He was wearing the same dirt-stained onesie, his feet bare, his expression unreadable. The timestamp printed at the bottom right read 09/01/19, 3:17 a.m., the exact morning before the Whitakers found him. But there was no camera crew in that area. No search team had been sent beyond the slab that night. The slab had been under surveillance. No one had entered, no one had left, and yet someone had taken that photo. Jacob showed it to Dana. Her hands began to tremble, and Todd. She left the room without a word. When Jacob tried to ask Silas about it, the boy only glanced at it, then looked away. He said, "That's not me anymore." That same afternoon, Sheriff Harding was shown the photo. He stared at it for a long time, saying nothing. Then he opened his desk drawer, pulled out a sealed manila envelope of his own, and laid it beside the Grangers. Inside was another Polaroid, taken by a trail cam the morning Silas reappeared. Same clearing, same child, same timestamp. Except this one showed no one. The two images were compared, the trees matched, the shadows aligned. But in one, Silas stood alone on the slab. In the other, the slab was empty. Identical angle, identical time. One image with the boy, one image without, and both existed, undeniably. Sheriff Harding stood up, locked both envelopes in his filing cabinet, and said quietly, "Someone's keeping two versions of this story. One of them just mailed theirs." It was a clerk at the county records office who found it. She was cross-referencing old forestry maintenance permits when a fire incident report surfaced in a mislabeled box marked 1992. Agricultural burn logs. Inside was a single manila folder, no barcode, no stamp. It wasn't even cataloged in the digital system, just handwritten on the tab. Benton Ridge, FSR 109, April 1997. It had been filed as a brush fire, but what it described wasn't. The report was from a seasonal fire crew operating out of La Grande. On April 3, 1997, a fire had been reported deep in the timberline near Lot 14B, the future site of the Granger home. Aerial surveillance identified a smoke column just off an unmarked service road. By the time ground units arrived, the fire had burned out. But what they found was strange. A 4x6 patch of earth, burned to ash, completely isolated, no surrounding scorch, no lightning strike, no signs of ignition. And in the center of the charred soil, a melted steel object, twisted and warped beyond recognition. No wires, no casing, just a plate of metal, fused to the ground. The fire crew flagged the site for follow-up, but none ever came. The report was signed off with a barely legible scrawl and a printed name that had long since faded. The clerk enhanced it digitally. The name, Wesley Harding. But Harding hadn't joined the sheriff's department until 2002. He would have been 19 years old in 1997. Not a firefighter, not a county employee, certainly not someone authorized to sign an incident report. When confronted, Harding stared at the copy for a long time. Finally, he whispered, "That's my father's handwriting." His father, Edward Harding, had died in 2001. A decorated Army intelligence officer posted overseas for most of the 1990s, no record of him ever serving with the Forestry Service. And yet, there it was, his signature, in black ink, on a fire report from a county he never worked in, filed on land he never visited, officially. Harding pulled the file and placed it in a locked drawer. 2 days later, he requested access to classified records tied to regional government contracts during the late 90s, specifically, any referencing private infrastructure, non-disclosure field operations, or sealed civilian complaints. He received a message the next morning from a restricted address. Clearance not available for regional law enforcement. Do not pursue FSR 109. Status handled. Entry denied until recall. Same phrase etched under the slab. Same voice, still speaking. It happened just after 3 a.m. the following Friday. Dana Granger awoke to the sound of the front door closing, softly, carefully, not like a slam, but like someone had just slipped out. Jacob was already awake. He'd heard it too. There was no crash, no glass, no alarm. The motion sensor light on the porch hadn't triggered. But when Jacob stepped into the hallway, the air smelled different, faintly metallic, like warm coins and soil after rain, a smell that didn't belong in a sealed house. They checked the windows, all locked. They checked Silas's room. He was asleep, but sitting upright, eyes open, not blinking. When Donna gently called his name, he turned to her slowly and whispered, "He was checking to see if I forgot." She didn't ask who. She didn't want the answer. They called the sheriff's office. Deputy Voss arrived within 20 minutes. He swept the perimeter, found no signs of forced entry, no prints, no pry marks. Nothing. Until he reached the kitchen. There, on the kitchen table, placed neatly beside an untouched bowl of fruit, was a sheet of yellowing paper, folded once. No envelope, no signature, just a drawing, made in crayon, childlike, sloppy, but precise in one haunting way. It depicted a small house, scribbled in red, surrounded by tall black trees. A boy stood outside, next to a rectangle in the ground, a hatch. Above it, a figure hovered, not standing, not floating, but suspended. No feet, no face, just a vague oval outline with long arms that stretched into the trees. Beneath it, written in childish handwriting, "Not done yet." The Grangers had never seen that paper before. And more disturbing, neither had Silas. When shown the drawing later that morning, he shook his head and said, "That's not mine. It's his. He drew it with my hand." Forensics couldn't find prints. The page was tested for age. The ink was less than 24 hours old, but the paper, it was dated by watermark from 1995. Deputy Voss left with the sheet sealed in an evidence bag. Sheriff Harding filed it under anonymous threat, unidentified origin. But that night he told one deputy not to return to the Granger home. "If this is a warning," he said, "it's not meant for us." 3 days after the crayon drawing appeared in the Granger home, Silas began to draw his own. He used the back pages of an old coloring book, never asked for help, never said what he was making, just sat for hours by the front window, head tilted slightly, crayon in hand, tongue pressed to the corner of his lip, focused. He made 4 drawings. The first showed a circle of trees but with no center, just a ring of trunks forming what looked like an eye. Silas labeled it, in shaky letters, "The place I don't remember going." The second was simpler, a series of vertical red lines descending from what appeared to be a sun with no rays, floating in a black sky. Beneath it, the lines touched stick figures, drawn lying down. Some had X's for eyes. He titled it, "The Light That Picked Who Stayed." The third was blank except for a small figure, alone in a clearing, looking upward. Above him was a spiral, drawn in gray. Underneath, Silas wrote, "It wasn't a sound, it was a turning." But it was the fourth that made Dana leave the room. It showed their house from above, roofline, chimney, the garden in back. Inside the roof, in cutaway style, were 3 stick figures, Mom, Dad, Silas. And just outside the yard fence, pressed against it, was a tall shape, longer than the others. It had no eyes, no mouth, just arms that reached to the ground. One hand was lifted, touching the fence. Silas called it. He knows the sky wasn't supposed to open again. Dana brought the drawings to Sheriff Harding. Harding said nothing. He simply opened a drawer and pulled out a still photograph, taken by one of the drones on the second night of the search. It hadn't made it into the official file. Too grainy, too odd. It showed the tree canopy above the Granger home. Nothing special, until you adjusted the contrast. There, centered in the sky above the house, was a faint spiral shape, not cloud, not shadow. It had not appeared in any other frame before or after. The timestamp, 3:17 a.m. The exact moment Silas would later be seen on the slab, in the photo that wasn't taken. Harding asked Silas, "Did you hear anything?" Silas paused, then said, "I didn't hear it, but I felt him turning." Sheriff Harding was running out of leads, and yet one name kept surfacing, in hushed mentions, in old maintenance logs, in the back corners of files marked non-disclosable. A man who'd worked the Benton Ridge timber lines back in the 1970s, a fire watcher, a surveyor, a technician. Depending who you asked, Malcolm Rudd had worn different hats. But everyone agreed on one thing. He'd seen something. Harding drove 2 hours west into the edge of the Blue Mountains, where Rudd lived in a trailer wrapped in chicken wire and aluminum siding. No mailbox, no doorbell, just a row of old coffee cans hanging from a string, clattering faintly in the breeze. Malcolm answered before Harding knocked. Late 80s, long beard, one milky eye, but his voice was steady. "You're here about the boy." Harding didn't respond right away. Malcolm stepped aside. They sat at a table covered in old topographical maps, rusted tools, and piles of what looked like burned paper. The air inside smelled like pine resin and solder. A ham radio crackled gently from the corner, though nothing was being said. When Harding showed him the photo of the slab, the spiral in the sky, Malcolm nodded slowly. "That's the second time it opened." Harding asked, "Second?" Malcolm tapped a worn leather folder with trembling fingers. "First time was in 67. Took 2 boys from a scout group camping near Ridge 5. No prints, no screams. One kid saw it happen. Just said, they turned wrong. Said they stepped into a place that wasn't where it was supposed to be." He flipped the folder open. Inside were sketches, rough, smudged, all done in pencil. The shapes were familiar. The spiral, the faceless figure, the trees without shadows, and one more, a rectangle in the ground, circled in red. "That's the hatch," Malcolm said, "but it wasn't built. It was revealed, like the ground let it show." Harding leaned forward. "Who poured the slab?" Malcolm just smiled, not kindly, not mockingly. "Doesn't matter who covered it. That's not what keeps it shut. It's whether or not it's been seen." He reached under the table and pulled out a black notebook, taped at the spine. Inside, one phrase had been written again and again, hundreds of times in different pens on different pages. "You're safe as long as it doesn't see you." Harding asked, "Then why leave the house?" Malcolm looked up with his one good eye. "Because eventually, Sheriff, it wants to be remembered." It started as a dare. A local teen, Brandon Kerr, 17, varsity track, part-time stalker at Hartlow Market, known for pushing limits, boasted to friends that he'd go stand on the slab at night and come back with a selfie. The town was still on edge from the Granger incident. Kids were told to stay away from the ridge, but Brandon had always been good at getting attention. He posted a blurry video on social media at 9:14 p.m., walking toward the old utility trail with a flashlight and saying, "I'll be back in 20, unless the sky eats me or something." It was meant to be a joke. He never came back. When Brandon's parents called the sheriff's office the next morning, Deputy Voss checked the phone's last GPS ping. It placed him within 20 feet of the slab at 9:27 p.m. A search team went out before sunrise. The site was undisturbed, no drag marks, no blood, no sign of a struggle. His flashlight was found standing upright, balanced, beam pointed straight into the woods. But his phone wasn't there. It was found 2 hours later, nearly 80 yards north, buried beneath a layer of pine needles as if someone, or something, had covered it. The casing was cracked, but the phone still worked. The camera had been recording the entire time. Footage length, 5 hours, 43 minutes. The first 11 minutes were uneventful. Brandon walking, making jokes, panning the flashlight, finally arriving at the clearing. Then something changed. The audio picked up a soft, pulsing hum, too low for most speakers. The flashlight beam began to bend, visually bend, on screen, as though light was being pulled in a different direction. Brandon stopped talking. The video jostled, then static. For nearly 4 hours after that, the footage was black. No movement, no light. Then, at 2:31 a.m., the feed abruptly resumed. The camera was lying sideways. In the frame, Brandon, standing about 10 feet from the slab, completely still. His eyes were open, his face blank. His mouth was slightly ajar, but he wasn't breathing. No fog, no rise of the chest. Then slowly, his head turned directly toward the camera. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just watched. The recording ended at 3:00 a.m. sharp. That footage has never been released to the public. The next morning, Deputy Voss resigned. No notice, no letter. He packed a single duffel bag and left town. His voicemail to Harding was short. "We're not watching it. It's watching back." The vehicle arrived just before dawn. A black SUV, no plates, no markings, parked outside the sheriff's office at 5:43 a.m. 2 men stepped out. Clean cut, mid-40s, identical gray windbreakers. One carried a briefcase, the other a slim folder with no labels. Sheriff Harding greeted them outside, half expecting this moment. Neither man gave a name. They didn't ask to sit, didn't accept coffee. The man with the briefcase opened it, laid 3 documents on the desk, and said, "You'll sign the bottom of the 3rd page, nothing else." Harding read them carefully. A temporary suppression order, citing regional infrastructure protection protocols. A confidentiality directive enforcing non-disclosure under internal federal code. And a final sheet, blank, save for a signature line and the words, "Reassignment of investigative priority, oversight, transferred." Harding asked, "To who?" The man didn't answer. He simply pointed at the paper. Harding signed it. They didn't take files. They didn't ask about Silas. They didn't mention the phone, or the drawing, or the photographs that shouldn't have existed. They only asked one question. "Has the child spoken to the trees again?" Harding lied, said no. They nodded. As they left, one of them turned back briefly and said, "You handled this well, Sheriff. Just remember, not everything that returns is supposed to." That evening, when Harding returned to his office after sunset, he found a single envelope slipped beneath his door. Inside was a photo, black and white, slightly blurred. It showed a school group, late 1950s by the clothing, lined up in front of a small building with a sign that read, "Benton Ridge Elementary, 22 children, 2 teachers, and there, second row from the front, holding hands with a girl whose face had been scratched out, stood a young boy. His face was unmistakable. Silas Granger. Same eyes, same ear, the same birthmark above the left eyebrow. It wasn't similar. It was identical. On the back of the photo, written in faded blue ink, "He's been returned before." 3 nights after the SUV left town, Sheriff Harding returned to the woods, alone again. He left no note. No deputy was notified. He parked his cruiser farther out this time, nearly a mile from the ridge, and walked in on foot. No flashlight, no gun, only the old compass from his father's desk and the folded photograph of Silas from 1958 tucked into his breast pocket. It was 3:04 a.m. He reached the slab at 3:16. The air was motionless. No breeze, no insects, no night sounds. Just the soft hush of leaves that should have rustled, but didn't. The trees stood still, too still, like they were listening. Harding stepped forward, stopping at the edge of the concrete, where the soil had recently sunken inward, only slightly. The outline of the hatch was still visible beneath the moss. A fine trace of dew traced its seam, glowing faintly under the half-moon. And then he heard it. Not knocking, not voices. A low, mechanical hum. Deep, consistent, not loud, but inside him, like it wasn't carried by air, but bone. His teeth vibrated, his spine felt hollow, and the trees behind him leaned ever so slightly forward, though there was no wind to move them. Then, another sound. A soft click, like metal flexing, like something unlatching. Harding stepped back, just 1 pace. And that's when it happened. Not a shape, not a figure, but a shift in the darkness itself. A part of the tree line, where there had been nothing, now wasn't empty. A vertical shimmer, slightly darker than the black around it, like a doorway made of memory. And at its edge, a single hand, long and still and too smooth, slowly reached around the trunk of a pine. Harding didn't run. He just said one word, barely audible. "Why?" There was no reply, but from behind the slab, from beneath it, came a sound not meant for open air, a breath that didn't start or end, a sound without echo. He turned and walked away, leaving the hatch behind him. The next morning, Harding submitted his resignation. No press, no explanation, just a single sentence scribbled on the back of his badge certificate. "It doesn't take them, it returns them wrong." The Grangers moved a month later. No forwarding address. Silas was last seen on a security camera at a gas station in Pendleton, staring directly into the lens as his mother paid for fuel. He blinked once and smiled.